Ish. Okay. Maybe they can then come and change it as needed. All right, so it's exactly 2 o'clock. I want to start Vivian Lyon's final examination for the PhD degree. Thank you so much for coming today. It's also called Dissertation Defense. Has been a very long tradition in academia to call it defense, but hopefully there will be no offense. You just enjoy your presentation. The way this works, as some of you, as many students probably know, but also for Vivian's family, we will devote the first 45 to 50 minutes to her presentation. And then we have about 10-15 minutes, depending on when exactly Vivian finishes. Time for you all to ask questions. About 3 o'clock or 3:05, depending on how things proceed. Then we'll ask you to please leave the room, except members of her dissertation committee. And then we will, behind closed doors, we will have some further conversations with Vivian about her dissertation. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Vivian. I have worked with her now for the past 4 or 5 years, and I have found some really incredible characteristics of hers that I thought I would share with you, maybe through some photos throughout her life. So I've always found her to be very thoughtful. Whenever we have a conversation, she's very contemplative. She thinks about the questions that come up. She also is very excited. She has this excitement to answer new questions, come up with new ways of tackling really difficult scientific questions. I think she's been probably like that since she was born. She's also very creative and imaginative and ambitious. Through some of the publications that she has completed, that I will talk to you about shortly, she really has shown how artistic she is in terms of issues of study design and architectural factors when it comes to how to configure a study to really reach the most rigorous finding possible. I really enjoyed working with her, especially because of her creativity. She truly leads with generosity and compassion. I think many people who have been working with Vivian in different contexts know how incredibly helpful she is to other people around her. She always wants to help people, and that has been really amazing to see in the Department of Epidemiology and School of Public Health, and for us who have been working with her really closely in the past several years. She's very skilled and successful. She works really hard, and she's studious. We've had conversations maybe by email at like 11 p.m. or 12 a.m. or 1 a.m. to talk about details and nuances in her work. And I really admire her because of the consistency that she has shown, despite obviously being a very busy mom and many other commitments that she has. Vivian, I was communicating with Steve Hawes, the chair of the Department of Epidemiology this morning, who was very sad to miss this defense because there's actually a faculty meeting going on right now in the Department of Epidemiology. And he said to tell you that you really have been one of the faces of leadership on the student side in our department. We don't go through all of these one by one, but you can see really this exemplifies what a leader Vivian has been over the past 4 or 5 years. She has numerous achievements, stellar academic achievements. She did receive her bachelor's in science and master of public health and epidemiology from UW. She received a couple of grants from Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute and Centers for Disease Control. She was a trainee for ITHS. She visited a scholarship at Harvard Injury Control Center with some of the best experts in firearm injury in the world. She received numerous awards that you can see here, some of them 3 or 4 times. She was also recognized as the UW School of Public Health Endowed Fellow. Through her really wonderful work and rigorous work, she has published several papers, about 19 total, and 31 scientific presentations and reports. On several of them, she's the first author. And these were hard papers to write. I can attest to several of them. The one on the top left that really looked at the issue that we in epidemiology typically don't work really hard on, which is, well, when you have an analysis of time to event, you usually just focus on the first one and you toss the rest of the information away. So she worked very closely with us, and especially Marco, who is joining us via Zoom, to tackle that question. Another one, top right, she worked on design variation instead, which really was born based on a real world need for having design variations that could tackle more than one exposure. And several other things that she has done, which has been really, truly wonderful. She will start her postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan and also working here with Dr. Frederick and me at the University of Washington in January, I suppose, after finishing her PhD here. This is the largest NIH award ever given for firearm injury. It's a consortium, national consortium, around the country with many universities involved. Dr. Rivera and I represent the University of Washington, so we are delighted to be working with Vivian at least for 2 more years. So with that, maybe I'll ask Vivian to come here and start her presentation.
Let me just, hey Rod? Yeah.
Everybody hear me? Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come to my defense. It's titled Following the Firearm Injury, Recidivism and Behavior Change. I'm not going to take my husband's advice and present an offense. Instead, I'll actually be presenting the work that I've done over the last many years. So I'll start with a brief background, and then I'll spend the bulk of my time on A1, which was an evaluation of the Helping Individuals with Firearm Injuries study. During A2, I'll talk about a fidelity assessment that we conducted as part of the Helping Individuals with Firearm Injury study. And then A3, looking at fire-related behavior change following firearm injury. And all 3 of these aims are nested within the one Helping Individuals with Firearm Injury study. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, the study structure. Then I'll talk about conclusions and implications and end with a Q&A. So firearm injuries are a substantial public health problem. There are 36,000 people who die by firearms every year, an average of 100 per day, and many more with non-fatal injuries. There's approximately 250 people who present to an emergency department in the King County area each year for a firearm injury. These are especially vulnerable people, so in addition to being at high risk of arrest and subsequent injury, patients with firearm injuries need help not just to heal with their physical wounds, but also their psychological trauma and support as they transition back to the community post-injury. There's been limited evidence for prior hospital or community-based interventions that have focused specifically on patients with violent injuries. So many have had small sample sizes, limited follow-up, and while some have found these programs to be effective at reducing risk of subsequent arrest and injury, others have found no effect. To date, there have been no randomized trials evaluating the effectiveness of a joint hospital and community-based violence intervention program specifically offered to patients with firearm injury. So enter the HIFI study. HIFI was a cluster randomized controlled trial of behavioral intervention offered among patients with firearm injuries who presented to Harborview Medical Center for treatment with randomization by week. To be enrolled, patients must be over 18 years old, understand English, be discharged back to the community, and live in one of our 5 study counties here, highlighted in purple. The intervention consisted of 3 main components. It started with hospital-based motivational interviewing designed to engage the patient with the intervention. It followed a 6-month-long behavioral intervention, which was an adaptation of the critical time intervention that I'll talk about more in a minute. And finally, it also had a multidisciplinary team which provided support to our support specialist in case management. These were made up of members representing the local organizations, law enforcement in the area. The control was usual care. And our main outcome of interest was arrest, which served as a proxy for crime, although we know that's not perfect. And there were a number of secondary outcomes, so injury, mental health, aggression, and substance use, although I'm going to focus the presentation on arrest and injury, as these two constitute the concept of recidivism, which is of most interest to hospital-based violence prevention programs. So the critical time intervention, or CTI, was first developed in the 80s in New York City to reduce homelessness in men with mental illness. It has received a top-tier rating by the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy, and from the beginning it was really designed to be offered to multiple populations, not just this particular population. It's a time-limited, evidence-based case management program which mobilizes support for vulnerable people during a period of transition, and it has been used to support people with mental illness, veterans, people who've recently been incarcerated, as well as many other populations, although it has yet to be applied to patients with firearm injuries only. So CTI was originally developed as a 9-month-long intervention, but we adapted it over 6 months to fit within our study timing constraints. It starts with a pre-CTI phase, which is the motivational interviewing that I mentioned before, as well as goal setting conducted with our study specialist. I'm just going to turn this volume down a little bit. There we go. So it starts with the pre-CTI phase, then it has a 2-month-long phase 1, which is a transition phase. So this includes making home visits, providing support to the patients and existing caregivers, and introducing the client to new supports. This is followed by phase 2, the tryout phase, where the interventionist observes the operation of the support networks, mediates conflicts between patients and caregivers, and encourages the patient to take more responsibility for their care coordination. And finally, phase 3, this final phase, the interventionist steps back to ensure that the supports can function independently without them, and develops a long-term plan for, with the patient to achieve long-term goals. Another way that Hi-Fi was different from the initial CTI program is that we allowed more contacts to occur between the interventionist and our patients over the phone and via text messaging, and this we decided to do because our patients were spread over a 5-county geographic region, and we had only a single interventionist. So aim 1. Was the Hi-Fi study effective at reducing risk of arrest and injury? This was really our guiding question, and we were interested in both the first year and the first 2 years following hospital discharge. But the single question for me is really 2 questions of interest. So the first, what is the effect of intervention assignment, which is the intent to treat analytic approach? We answered this with 3 analyses. The Cox proportional hazard model looked at time to first injury or time to first arrest. The Prentice, Williams, and Peterson multiple failure survival model looks at all arrests and all injuries that occurred during the follow-up period. And then we used G computation for greater statistical efficiency, greater interpretability, and some relaxed assumptions. However, none of these analytic approaches actually look at what happens when a patient engages with the intervention. So our second question is, what is the effect of actually receiving the full intervention? And this is the per protocol effect analysis. We'll answer this again with G computation, but it's implemented differently. So we conducted surveys which included standardized assessments for a wide variety of health-related domains. Surveys were conducted at baseline, 1, 3, 6, 9, and 12 months post-hospital discharge, and were completed either in person, online, or over the phone. Because patients had to be in the community in order to experience an event of interest, or arrest or injury, we excluded time if they'd exited the community. So for both arrest and injury, we excluded hospitalizations, moving out of the state, any incarceration, and then death. And patients were allowed to re-enter the risk pool after the termination of that particular event. One of the strengths of this study was that we used administrative data sets for our outcome ascertainment. So I worked with 11 unique data sets for injury, arrest, and censoring ascertainment, and linked 5 data sets probabilistically. So I'll talk a little bit more about that now. So to assess injury, we started first with data from the Collective Medical Technologies Emergency Department Information Exchange dataset. And this includes information on any emergency department visit for our enrolled patients going back to 2014, anywhere in the state of Washington. It includes information on the emergency department they visited, the time and date of the visit, but for the majority of these cases, they didn't have complete chief complaint information, so we weren't able to determine, using this data set alone, whether or not the injury was an incident injury or if the visit was injury related at all. So in order to fill in those gaps, we supplemented with the Harborview Medical Center electronic medical records, the Epic Systems Corporation Care Everywhere, and the Washington State Department of Health Rapid Health Information Network, and used all of these to fill in the gaps to create one unified emergency department visit data set. For hospitalizations, we used the Comprehensive Hospital Abstract Reporting System, and then vital records for deaths. For arrests, we used Washington State Patrol Identification and Criminal History Section, and the Administrative Office of the Court's Judicial Information System, and we had a two-person adjudication process whereby we reviewed any arrests and ensured that we weren't double counting and there were no duplicates to identify incident arrests during the follow-up period. Finally, for time at risk, we included Office of Financial Management Jail Booking and Reporting System, which includes data on every jail in the state of Washington. However, they're not allowed to report out data from King County jails, so we additionally supplemented with King County jail systems and identified incarcerations this way. We brought down data from the Comprehensive Hospital Abstract Reporting System for hospitalization, length of stay, and vital records for deaths. And then finally, we added in locating information from our follow-up surveys that I discussed earlier to identify moves in and out of Washington State that occurred in the first 12 months following enrollment. So enrollment. There were a total of 279 eligible patients with firearm injuries during our enrollment period, of which we enrolled 232, so 83%. And although we utilized randomization, there were some patient characteristics that were unevenly distributed between study arms. So I've shown here sex, along with all of the covariates and baseline characteristics with over a 10% standardized difference. Compared to the control arm, patients in the intervention arm were less stably housed, had lower income, and had a slightly higher proportion of prior arrest. So you can see that this intervention group here is especially vulnerable. At 1 year post-discharge, more patients in the intervention arm had at least one arrest compared to the control group, a higher unadjusted incidence rate and an incidence rate ratio estimate suggesting an increased risk of arrest in the intervention group compared to the control group. However, which you can see because the estimate is above 1, that 1.23. However, because the 95% confidence intervals indicated within the parentheses includes 1, this means it's not statistically significant. And this relationship held true at the 2-year mark as well. And here the number at 2 years is the cumulative number of arrests, not between the 1 and 2 year mark. For injury, we see a very similar pattern, both at the 1 year and at the 2 year mark. So returning to our guiding questions, I want to focus on this first question. What is the effect of intervention assignment accounting for differences in baseline covariates at the 1 and 2 year mark post-discharge? And before I dive into this, I just want to say we did all these analyses for both the 1 and 2 year mark, and the results were consistent. So I'm only going to be presenting the first year, but I do have their second year results as well if anyone wants to see those at the end. So we started with the Cox proportional hazards ratio, which compares the incidence rate of first arrest or injury between the intervention group and the control group at each time t. And I want to direct your attention to this figure, which illustrates the first 6 months of hypothetical follow-up for 5 hypothetical patients in our study. You can see here that some patients contribute an arrest and an injury, some patients contribute 2 arrests, 2 injuries, and this patient here at the bottom had no events but was hospitalized and excluded from our risk pool set for a brief period of time. When we look at time to first injury, we're including only the time until the first injury occurs. We're not looking at any, arrest. We're not looking at any injuries, and we're not looking at any subsequent arrests. For injuries, similarly, we're looking at time until that first injury, no arrests, and no subsequent injuries. And people exit the risk pool after that first injury occurs. And it includes baseline covariates assessed at the beginning of the study. This analysis looks at not just whether or not the outcome occurred, but also the time until the outcome occurred. So it's very simple to implement. It has a quick look at the effect of treatment assignment, and it does account for differences in patient characteristics by study arm using those baseline covariates. However, it has strong model assumptions which are often violated, and it has limited interpretability. For those of you who are not familiar with biostats, epi, and statistics, the hazard ratio is not easily interpretable. And it, again, does not account for intervention adherence, so it's just looking at whether or not someone was randomized to the control or the intervention group by week. The hazard ratio for arrest at 1 year post-hospital discharge has an estimate which suggests an increased risk of arrest in the intervention group compared to the control group, but again, this is not statistically significant. For injury at 1 year post-discharge, the intervention group had a higher risk of incident injury here. But what if we want to look not just at the time to first, but time to any arrest or time to any injury that occurred during follow-up? So for this, we'll use the Prentice, Williams, and Peterson multiple failure survival model. Again, we have this figure, and we're going to be looking for arrest, including all the data up until the end of the study, allowing people to contribute multiple arrests, but not looking at any injuries. And when we look at injury, we're going to include all subsequent recurrent injuries and keep people in the study until the end of the follow-up period, unless they had some sensory event. Here again, we're including those baseline covariates. So this looks at the effective treatment assignment. It does account for differences in patient characteristic by study arm, and it has more testable model assumptions than the Cox model that I presented earlier. However, it has the same limited interpretability and again does not account for intervention adherence. Like with the Cox model, the hazard ratio for arrest at 1 year, it could be suggestive of an increased risk of arrest in the intervention group compared to the control group, but it, again, is not statistically significant. For injury 1 year post-discharge, the intervention group has an increased risk of injury, but you can see that the effect estimate has been attenuated towards 1 compared to the Cox model. So now moving on to G computation. I want to start with this hypothetical study population, which is an illustration of how these last two analyses have looked at the data. So they take our study population where there's a distribution of characteristics, in this case sex, that's unequal between the intervention and the control arm, and it compares the people who were actually assigned to the intervention group to the people who were actually assigned to the control group and the outcomes in each. But what if we wanted to know what the outcomes would be for a hypothetical scenario where we assigned everyone to the intervention group and then used a time turner and went back in time and reassigned everyone to the control group and compared the outcomes in each? So that's the counterfactual framework that the next two analyses are going to draw on. And it's really powerful because it allows us to get good statistical estimates for this hypothetical scenario where we get to see what would have happened if we could have observed the same people under multiple treatment regimes. So the intent to treat G computation estimates the counterfactual proportion of patients who are arrested or injured through time t and compares outcomes assuming everyone was assigned to the intervention to the outcomes if everyone had been assigned to the control. So process-wise, it starts by fitting a Cox model like we did in that very first analysis, and then it uses that Cox model to predict the outcomes assuming everyone had been assigned to the intervention group and assuming everyone had been assigned to the control group. This does account for differences in patient characteristics by study arm using, again, those baseline covariates. It does have greater interpretability. Now we're able to report not just the hazard ratio, but the proportion of patients who we expect would have an outcome at different time points. It has greater statistical efficiency, and it relaxes the independent censoring assumption a little. However, it's harder to implement, and it does not account for intervention adherence, and it does assume correct model specification. So the proportion of patients expected to have an arrest at 1 year if everyone had been assigned to the control group is around 20%. Here the C stands for control. And if everyone had been assigned to the intervention group, we would have expected 26% to have been arrested at 1 year. The relative risk comparing those shows an estimate suggesting a potential increased risk of arrest in the intervention compared to the control group, but again, not statistically significant. For injury, we see 20% we would have expected to have an injury in the control group, and 30% we would have expected to have an injury in the intervention arm. And here, unlike the Cox and the Prentice, Williams, and Peterson multiple failure survival model, this is now no longer a significant association. It looks like the estimate is much more attenuated towards 1 and not statistically significant. So all three of these methods answer that first question of interest, which is what is the effective treatment assignment? What happens when you offer the treatment to everyone? But none of these analyses answer the question of what actually happens when a patient engages with our interventionist. So for that, we'll look at this second question, G computation. Again, we're using that counterfactual framework, but instead of using it at a single time point, now we're going to be moving through time. So we're interested to see what happens when a patient engages with our interventionist for phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And just as a illustration of the complexity required in the data to answer this question, I want us to think about someone who's adherent to our intervention, CTI at phase 1. That's going to be related to whether or not they engage with our interventionist and are adherent at phase 2. This is going to be related, presumably, to whether or not they have an arrest. And whether or not they engaged at that first time point could also be related to arrest, separately from its relationship through the second time point. Many of our CTI patients were interested in stable housing as a goal, and so we're going to add stable housing here, where if someone engaged with our interventionist during the phase 1, that could be related to either becoming stably housed or maintaining stable housing, and someone's either maintaining stable housing or becoming stably housed. Engagement with our interventionist could influence whether or not they're interested in engaging with our intervention at time 2. Finally, whether or not someone is stably housed could have a relationship with whether or not they are arrested. And this is problematic because, as many of you can see, this is stable housing is now a mediator of an early intervention node and the outcome of interest, and a confounder of a late intervention node and the outcome of interest. So we need more complex methods to account for this complexity. So we'll use G computation again, but here we're comparing patients under counterfactual adherence patterns to estimate the mean outcome. So this starts by fitting models to all the relevant variables in their assumed causal order. It does this recursively, moving backwards through time, and uses all the data that's been contributed up until that time point to estimate that particular model. It then resamples with all baseline covariates to form a Monte Carlo sample, and then it simulates follow-up using this Monte Carlo sample going forward. So it takes baseline covariates and engagement during CTI1 to predict outcomes at that time step, and then brings that information down into the second time step and does this forward through time, averaging across the population for the outcome of interest. And it does this for each treatment regime separately. So this does account for intervention adherence, and it's able to include those post-randomization variables. Now we have counterfactual adherence patterns, which is really powerful because we can say, not just we're interested in someone engaging with our intervention 1 point for each intervention phase, but multiple points, 3 points, 5 points of contact with our interventionist per phase. And again, it has improved interpretability, so we're able to report not just the hazard ratio, but relative risk, risk difference, and the proportion with each outcome, the expected proportion in each under each regime. However, this does look at adherence in 2 months intervals because of the way our intervention was defined. So we did not account for censoring that it occurred over a 1 or 2 day period. It needed to occur for more than 2 months to be counted in this particular analysis. And again, this has a more complex analytic approach, so that's a little challenging. So with G computation, if everyone had been assigned to the control group, we would expect 36% to have an arrest by the first year. If everyone had been assigned to the intervention group and engaged with our interventionist at least once per phase, we would have expected 33% to have an arrest. The adjusted relative risk shows a significant reduction in risk of arrest, comparing the counterfactual intervention assignment and participation to the counterfactual control. However, I do want to acknowledge that this effect estimate is modest and only just reaching statistical significance. For injury, we would expect the same proportion of patients in the control group and the intervention group to have an injury by the 1 year follow-up, and there's no significant association between the two. And here we can see that the accounting for a patient's engagement with the intervention, we see that the intervention is now associated with arrest and with a decreased risk of arrest. And unlike in the Cox and the Prentice Williams and Peterson multiple failure survival, there's no significant relationship between intervention, participation, and injury. So I said earlier that one of the benefits of using G computation is that we can set different counterfactual adherence patterns and compare outcomes. So these are based on the models calculated in the first step in an earlier slide and not on observed data. But for arrest at the 1 year mark, we can see that the protective effect of high-fi increases with increasing contacts with our interventionist per phase. And for injury, we still see no significant difference when we change the number of contacts per phase, although the confidence intervals are widening quite a bit. So this HiFi study had a smaller sample size than we had originally planned or hoped for, although of course we don't hope for anyone to have a firearm injury. It does capture all injuries in the state of Washington that require treatment by the healthcare system at an emergency department, hospital, or that resulted in death. And it does capture all arrests that occurred in the state of Washington, although we know that arrest does not equal crime, and arrest is really a measure of exposure to the criminal justice system. The number and the variety of data sources that we used for outcome ascertainment and censoring is really a huge strength of the study. It was conducted exclusively among patients with firearm injuries, which gives us quite a bit more generalizability and to this population, and the use of sophisticated methods goes much beyond what typically happens with the analysis of a randomized controlled trial. So was the HiFi study effective at reducing the risk of arrest and injury? The first two analyses found no change in risk of arrest and increased risk of incident injury, although once we added more sophisticated methods that relaxed some assumptions, we saw that there was no change in risk of injury. We did see that actually engaging with the intervention, there was a decreased risk of arrest and there was no change in risk of injury. So in our preliminary analysis for HiFi, we saw only a decreased risk of arrest in people who engaged with our intervention, and it was smaller than expected. So that really spurred this aim 2, which was why did we not see a larger effect of the intervention? The first thing that comes to mind is, did we implement it well? And if we did implement it well, did we use the appropriate theories? Is this the correct intervention to have applied to this patient population? And if it was well implemented and we used the appropriate theory, is there some other explanation for why we didn't see an effect in line with what we had initially thought at the beginning of the study? So I'll answer this first question with a fidelity assessment, which we conducted while HiFi was ongoing. Fidelity is how well does an intervention's real-world implementation align with the intended implementation. And besides answering our question of was HiFi well implemented, a fidelity assessment can provide improved program implementation when it's conducted during an ongoing trial. It can identify challenges that are associated with intervention delivery, which can improve future programs. And it can offer insight into whether conflicting findings were driven by variability in program implementation. So I went to New York for a one-day in-person training with our colleagues who developed the CTI intervention, and I came back to Seattle and began a 4-month-long iterative adaptation process of the fidelity materials that were developed for the original CTI program to ensure that our adaptation of the fidelity assessment was in line with the original CTI goals and principles. Next, we actually conducted the fidelity assessment, so this included reviewing patient notes and contact documentation between our interventionist and intervention patients. We did an interview with our support specialist and a focus group with their supervisors. And finally, we created a patient dose measure to try to identify whether or not there were any individual patient characteristics at baseline that were associated with increasing or decreasing patient dose by the end of follow-up. And we did this because it's important to know if there are subpopulations of patients who need additional effort to engage with the interventionist. We did a pretty exhaustive literature search to try to identify if there were any roadmaps for how to calculate patient dose with the CTI intervention or similar programs, and didn't find any. So instead we used a continuous dose measure where each contact with our interventionist counted as one additional contact dose, and we counted any in-person, phone call, text message, or social media contacts. So these are our results. Each row here corresponds to a separate fidelity assessment item with its own sampling strategy, data sources, and rating system developed by our colleagues in New York City. It is 1 here at the bottom is not implemented, and 5 is ideally implemented, and you can see that there's a range of scores for each item. However, overall, we met 70% of all the fidelity items, which corresponded to a rating of well implemented. Following the fidelity assessment, we restructured our team meetings. We realized that our interventionist had been presenting at the end of the meeting, which meant often they were cut off and not able to discuss all the patient cases, so we restructured the meeting to allow a complete discussion for all of our patients. And then we also began tracking which patients were discussed at each meeting, which seemed simple, but was really an important change for us because we had been discussing only patients who were in active crisis. And by tracking patients that we discussed, every month we started discussing each patient's case at least once, which meant that we were able to use the collective minds and expertise of all the people in the room for each patient in the intervention arm and not just patients who were in crisis. I want to draw your attention to these 5 items here, which have lower scores, but I think really highlight the impact that a patient's desire to engage with the intervention can have on overall program implementation fidelity, as these 5 in particular were very much driven, the scores were driven by a patient's initial desire to connect with our interventionist and desire to stay engaged in the intervention. Of the 90 patients who completed the intervention at the time I was doing the fidelity assessment, we categorized the dose empirically using tertiles. So 31 patients had no contact with our interventionist during the study follow-up period, 29 had a low intervention dose, and 30 had what we call a high intervention dose. And when we looked at the patient baseline characteristics by these 3 groups, we saw that there were fewer males in the high intervention dose group, a fewer proportion of males compared to the low intervention group or low intervention dose or no dose, and fewer people with a history of arrest prior to study enrollment in the high intervention dose group compared to the low or no intervention dose group. We found that a fidelity assessment conducted during an ongoing trial improves intervention implementation, which really points to the potential need to have periodic fidelity assessments conducted, especially when there's a program that is conducted over multiple years. It definitely highlights important areas for future interventions on patients with firearm injuries. So we saw a lot of systems avoidance behaviors by our patients, which includes changing phone numbers, changing addresses, which definitely impedes a patient's ability to connect with our interventionist and receive the intervention. And then we think that additionally we'll need added engagement efforts for patients, especially males with a prior history of arrest, who are, if there's a similar program offered to the same patient population. So why did we not see a larger effect of the HiFi intervention? We think that HiFi was well implemented, and we think that we're using an appropriate theory. There's a wonderful program, Cure Violence, that was developed in Chicago, which has had a really noticeable effect at reducing subsequent violence in these similar patient population. However, they're able to have a much more intensive intervention, so they have multiple case managers, field offices, supervisors of the case managers. They work not just with the patient who's injured, but also their family, their friends, people who witnessed the violent incident, and we just didn't have the resources to do this. So in line with, we think that probably the biggest difference is the intensity between CTI and these other programs, which is why we think we didn't see a larger effect. So this brings us to aim 3. There have been prior interventions which have been effective at changing behavior following a sentinel event like a car crash. And it's possible that a firearm injury could similarly serve as a sentinel event for behavior change. Because we know firearm behavior puts patients at increased risk for firearm injury, this could be a point to intervene upon to support patients in their overall health and well-being, which was the goal of the HiFi study, following a firearm injury. To our knowledge, no prior study has looked at firearm-related behavior change following firearm injury. And knowing if some of these behaviors are modifiable opens the door for potential intervention development in the future. So does firearm-related behavior change following firearm injury? We developed and conducted a survey of firearm-related behaviors pre- and post-firearm injury to assess behavior change, looking at ownership, carrying, and storage specifically. We used a single survey with questions about pre- and post-behavior at one time point, and surveys were completed at the first follow-up survey time after that we rolled out this survey, since it wasn't started at the beginning of the HiFi study. We did not ask these questions at baseline to avoid re-traumatization, since some of our questions included injury circumstance questions. 54% completed the survey 1 month post-discharge, and the rest at the 3, 6, 9, or 12-month marks. The timing of survey completion was not associated with any behavior change, reducing the concern for recall bias. So of the 232 patients in our study, 163%, so a response proportion of 70%, responded to this survey. increasing firearm exposure. So this first column is a small group, and these were patients who became a firearm owner, began to carry a loaded handgun in public, obtained a concealed carry weapons permit, or increased frequency of concealed carry. The second column, decreasing firearm exposure, are patients who became a non-firearm owner, ceased to carry a loaded handgun in public, decreased frequency of concealed carry, and then there's, of course, the no change exposure category. And there were no patients that reported both increasing and decreasing behaviors, so these are mutually exclusive categories, although they were not initially, that was not an initial requirement. There was patients with decreasing behavior change had fewer prior arrests to enrollment and more unintentional injuries compared to our other groups. And there was no significant intervention effect with the CTI intervention that we found. The majority of patients reported no change in firearm exposure. 80% reported no change. However, among patients who were firearm owners at the time of their injury, which is 53 patients, 60% reported some behavior change and about 30% became non-firearm owners. Next, I'm going to show a Sankey diagram, which is a type of flow diagram where the purpose is to illustrate change in states, in this case between firearm behaviors pre and post-injury. So we started by categorizing the 53 firearm owners who were patients who were firearm owners at the time of injury, and the one patient who became a firearm owner after injury, according to their ownership, carrying, and storage practices. And next, we categorized them by their post-firearm injury practices, and then looking at their increasing, decreasing, and no change, we categorized each patient's individual flow in between these groups. And, oh, it's so white, you can hardly see it. Shoot. So the reason I put this up here is just to show the diversity of firearm behavior changes. So not every behavior changed in the same way from this, the same pre-firearm injury behavior category, and there's no particular firearm behavior category at baseline that was particularly resistant to behavior change. So this was limited by self-report. There's, of course, the potential for recall bias or social desirability bias. However, this is the first study of firearm-related behavior change in this population, and I think really illustrates the variety and diversity of firearm-related behavior change. So does it change following firearm injury? Most patients did not. I think it's important to remember. However, in that subset of patients who were firearm owners at baseline, 60% changed behavior in some way, and it points to this being a potentially good population for behavioral intervention that is focused on improving safety following firearm injury. So putting it all together, I think the AIM-1 especially illustrates that methods really matter when we're analyzing even a randomized controlled trial. We found that high-fi intervention was effective at reducing risk of subsequent arrest if the patient engaged with the intervention. Our intervention was well implemented, and increasing intensity may improve the effect of the intervention. Patients with firearm injuries may be open to behavioral interventions aimed at improving firearm-related safety. Because there was a modest reduction in risk of arrest, and we think that a greater intensity might be related to a greater effect, but didn't have the resources with which to provide that increased intensity, we think there's a need to determine how to implement these higher intensity programs in under-resourced settings to best support patients with firearm injuries. There's, of course, a need to develop and test interventions to promote firearm-related safety behavior. Of course, we could be testing other social work-related interventions as well to support these patients in this especially vulnerable time. So I want to thank, of course, the study participants first and foremost, the study team, many of whom are here. Thank you so much for coming and for all of the work that you did contacting patients, enrolling patients, and really just offering your expertise. We had a diverse group of funding, both for the Hi-Fi study as well as my own funding. Of course, our partners with the Critical Time Intervention Center in New York, who partnered with us very closely. Our data managers and stewards, who were really instrumental in the both accessing data and really shaped my experience in this program. HFPRC staff, there's many more of you, but I just want to call out these ones for just being absolutely integral to my experience here. Of course, EPI staff and many EPI students who, oh darn, EPI students who have just done a tremendous amount of support for me over the last many years, including helping me work through the models and listening to my practice presentations. Of course, I need to thank my committee, and then also my incredible team of additional faculty mentors who supported my learning, shaped my thinking, written letters of support, and provided both many opportunities for both personal and professional growth. So, okay. Okay. So, to my high-five family, thank you. To my furry study buddy, to my HIPRC family, who again have seen every single presentation before I've given it, have managed my own anxieties and helped me think through all sorts of complex analyses. Thank you. To my family, who've shown up at every play and recital and now also this, thank you so much. And of course my friends who've really made this whole experience possible, and you've allowed me to keep my sanity, so thank you. For my mother-in-law Lori, who's not here because she's taking care of a sick, feverish baby, thank you for all of the baby care and support that you provided. Ali, thank you so much for all of your leadership, support, friendship. It would not have been possible without you, especially your generosity and care for Kieran every time I needed to bring him in. To my parents, who additionally cared a bunch for Kieran and made this last year possible, as well as just the lifetime of support that you've provided. To Kieran, who has shown me just what the human body is capable of doing with no sleep. And then, of course, to my husband, Tanner, without whom none of this would be possible. So, thank you.
Alright, so it's about 2:15, and I think we have about 10-15 minutes for questions by any and all.
Yes.
So I know you.
Yes.
So I'm just going to what's next? Because I have a feeling you're not done with some of this.
No, so I have actually even just 2 weeks ago I was at the FACS conference in Ann Arbor and talking with a friend about some additional analyses that we could do on HiFi to try to better understand the ways in which it worked and didn't work and on which populations. So that main aim one is definitely not done yet. Although Ali, I promise it will be done soon. I think moving forward, I'd love to still try to connect EPI methods and thinking really carefully about how we use which method and why to that translational science piece, which programs work, how can we actually support patients and people in the world who've had some sort of injury. So that's what I would like to be next for me. Yeah.
This was incredible. Well done. I have so many questions. I will stick to one for now. We can wrap up and then I'll ask the others. But my big question is whether you saw any difference between firearm injuries that might be classified as self-inflicted.
Oh, that's such a great question.
As opposed to
Yeah. So when we originally started the study, returning to the community was a criteria in order to be eligible to participate. And we realized about a year in that because of that criteria, we weren't including any self-inflicted firearm injuries. So that became something that we didn't have any patients with self-inflicted injuries. There were many, of course, unintentional, like discharge out of your pants pocket, but we didn't have any intentional self-inflicted firearm injuries, and so I don't know if this intervention would work well with that patient population or not. In some ways, I think that it might work better than in the patients that we did enroll, which were predominantly patients with assault-related firearm injuries, because we know that CTI does work well with people with mental illness. And so, and people, I think it has been tested among people with self-inflicted injuries before. So my guess is it would be similarly effective in that group.
Thanks.
Yes.
I understood like 2% of what you said, so I'm sorry if this is a bumpy loud question, but about the behavioral, the motivational interviewing at the beginning in the hospital, what was did you collect any data around that in terms of willingness to change? And if so, was that incorporated in the analysis at all?
Great question. So motivational interviewing, I'm sure as you know, is typically offered to promote behavior change. In this particular setting, we didn't use it for that purpose, but used it to motivate engagement with our intervention. So we weren't looking at any willingness to change behavior as part of that motivational interviewing piece. We did look at goal setting at that same meeting, so whether or not they had goals, and some patients didn't, which could be sort of a surrogate measure that we could use to look at whether or not they were willing to make behavior change, but no, we didn't look at that specifically. Yeah.
I applaud the fact that you do not seem even remotely discouraged. I mean that sincerely.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's just an incredible wealth of Ollie told me not to say brilliance, but I think brilliance in the minds of people that work on this, and I've just been so fortunate to get to work with and learn from them. So no, I'm not discouraged at all. Yeah.
Two questions. One, we make my slides in the future because your slides are so beautiful. But two is, it does seem to be a hint of an effect on increased risk of injuries. You know, you have sort of that nice kind of dose-response relationship. What do you think is going on there?
Well, I think there's, you know, we saw about 30% of patients don't engage with our intervention at all. And we know that the patients that we enrolled in the intervention were more vulnerable just at the onset. So my sense is that when we're looking only at the intervention assignment and we're not accounting for any engagement with the intervention, that we're not necessarily seeing the effect of the hi-fi intervention. I don't know that I'm answering it very well.
I guess I hypothesized that maybe hi-fi intervention is making them more functional, so they go back into the community again. But they're going back into the community again, which places an increased risk of injury.
Yeah, so that could definitely be, I think, another possible explanation that I think we would have seen in that dose response figure, if it had been there, would be if engaging with our interventionist made them more comfortable seeking treatment and have less systems avoidance behavior. I could see them presenting to emergency departments for treatment more frequently, but we didn't seem to see that. I will also say that the subsequent injuries was a very small group in our study, so we didn't have many incident injuries to include in our analysis. So I think the estimates are probably, we know that they're precise. Yeah. Yes?
So if the determinants of firearm injury are partially individual and partially structural, and we fail to intervene on individual stuff, can we frame that as an argument to intervene on the structural stuff? And I say this as a school of public health person. It seems to me that in a way what you're seeing there is that there are stronger determinants of re-injury than some individuals have the ability to work around. And I think that's actually a sort of powerful argument for not trying to intervene on those factors and intervening at the deeper, more sort of structural stuff.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you've had conversations like that, sort of where if there's any hope of that direction.
That's a phenomenal question and a really good framing. And you're definitely putting me on the spot because I don't remember having any conversations that specifically speak to that. But I completely agree, Steve. I think there's, and not just for firearm injuries, but for many injuries and violence in our communities broadly, there's definitely huge missed opportunities for structural change that could really support people and reduce injury and violence that I think we're not taking. And maybe if there were more public health people that were running for office or voting, we should all be voting today, I think we could see more implementation of those structural changes, but yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions? We still have a few minutes left.
Good evening, thanks for your kind presentation. In your church style analysis, it looks to me like women disproportionately injured numbers represented the people who sought help a little better. In that first group, it was so full of people that didn't bother to show up, and most men. Any difference in how those folks were injured, their initial injury? And I'm just wondering how you break them up.
Yeah, I don't have that. I don't have a table that I can pull up, unfortunately, with additional patient characteristics by that no dose, low dose, or high dose group. But if we go back to that slide, maybe not. Maybe we're not going back to that slide. I will. I'm not saying this is the slide thing to easily scroll, so I'll just leave this up here and say there was not any significant association between the injury intent and whether or not someone engaged with the intervention more or less. Although, like I was saying earlier, we didn't include all injury intents in this study, so we had mostly patients with a assault-related injury, very few patients with a legal intervention, and then about 25% of patients who had an unintentional injury. And there was no difference between those groups and the intervention dose.
So if I can follow up, women are just better at seeking help.
I don't know. I'm not going to answer that with a yes or no, but our interventionist was a female, so it's possible that they felt particularly comfortable engaging with her, and that other interventionists would be able to engage with a broader group of patients. Yeah.
Sorry, so what's the dream vision of intensity when you're talking about this program being better?
Oh,
Is it
that's
like
such a good question.
training or numbers or like who the interventionist is? What's like the best possible scenario?
Yeah, so I was actually talking with Fred about this last week. I think probably in-person contacts is the most important. I think phone calls and text messages, they can be really great for coordination of services, but are not necessarily going to have that same motivational interviewing potential that you could have in person, which of course was integrated along that 6-month-long intervention. So I think in person would be critical, and then some of the programs that have been effective have had meetings of like multiple times per week, every other week, which was more intensive than we had in our intervention. So I think quite a bit more than what we had in CTI. Yeah. Although I don't think there's a magic number. If there was, I would hope that everyone would be using it for all of these programs.
Okay, so it's exactly 2 o'clock with my watch, and we will ask you to please leave your room. Thank you so much for coming, and you will hear from us.